now that we went over Cycles and Eve, our rendering engines that we will mostly use, we are going to go over some settings for them so you can kind of know how to change stuff around to get lower or higher quality effects, or even change the color of your scene or something like that. So first thing that we're going to go over is cycles. So we already went through one option, and that is viewport rendering or sampling. This is basically how many arrays is going to be sent in your level, or how many arrays per pixel will be sent in your level. And usually you set viewport to something way lower than render, because render is kind of your final highest quality image. You can usually put this to maybe 1000, 2000, depends on what you're doing and the scale and the resolution of your image, and of course how long you want to wait. So it will also depend if you just want one frame, or maybe you're creating like a movie or something. If you want to render something that, let's say, takes 10 seconds and it's 30 FPS, that will be 300 frames. So taking like 1 to 2 hours per frame might not work for you. So this sampling level is, or samples, will be the one of the most important options for the quality. So if you maybe have a movie or something, you can decrease the samples, and of course if you have just one frame, maybe you can wait an hour or two, and then you can increase it a lot more and get way crisper image. Another thing that you should look at is CPU or GPU compute. This can depend on how you want your scene to render. So now that I set to GPU, there is speed change, so depends on what you have better in your PC. You can kind of change it in here if you want CPU or GPU to render it. And there is also some supported or experimental features that you can enable in here. If I set it to experimental, there'll be, we can see here subdivision was on, and there is probably some more options inside. But for now, we're going to go through supported. Yeah, and experimental, of course, will have higher propensity for crashes and stuff like that. So supported is kind of safe, but you can also experiment with some new features in Blender. Next thing, we can go to, let's see, advanced. I don't think we have anything in here that is important right now. You can also do adaptive sampling. This is basically when you want your samples to stop. So maybe you can say noise threshold. After we reduce noise by some percent in your image, we can say, okay, you just stop here. So maybe we set render samples to be 2000, but after maybe 1500, we want it to stop. And maybe each frame will have different noise values depending on what scene it is. So you can kind of set noise thresholds so you don't get so you don't always get some crazy render samples. You can just basically stop it when you think it's enough. After that, you have light paths. This is how many bounces you want per total bounces, and then you have per channels for your color, for your glossy, transparency. If you want higher quality transparency, you change this number here. If you're okay with lower diffuse, lower glossy, lower total max bounces, this will of course increase performance but decrease the quality. You can change it in here. You can also clamp your direct and indirect light. Basically, depending on what noise levels you want, you will change this for direct and indirect lighting. Usually you would notice more direct lighting, so you might want to change that. Here we also have caustics. We won't go through this since it's a bit more complicated. This is kind of refraction that happens when rays are going through water, so how that would affect it. But we won't go over that now. Then you have your volumes. So this is kind of the quality for your volumes, and volumes are usually used for particles or stuff like that. So what quality is for that? You have your hairs, if you're using hairs, what shape they are, and what primitive, but usually you won't mess with this, you'll just leave it to whatever it is already. You can simplify if you want your subdivision. So this is basically if you have your object that has a subdivision on it. So subdivision is basically a modifier, and it is actually applied in here. So basically I can make my model smoother and smoother. Let me see if I can actually show it. It's kind of already full, but if I click on this, we can see that it now has 4 times more detail. So you can kind of apply that to your objects and then tell your render that you want subdivisions to maybe stay at a really high value when you're rendering, but when you're rendering in the viewport, maybe you can decrease it so you have faster renders when you're previewing your scene. That can be useful, but usually you won't play with this unless it's a really big scene or a really high polygon mesh. Then you would use Simplify. If you run to your motion blur in the scene, you would use motion blur. It's pretty simple, just enable it, and then you have your shutter speeds, stuff like that. Basically how much motion blur you want. This kind of trying to replicate how camera would do the effect. In film, here the one important value is the transparency. So if I enable this and try to move this away, we can see how we have transparent parts, but without transparency, we basically would always render the background. If there is nothing in the background, it will still render a color. So if you want this or not want this, so that's the main thing. You have the exposure, but you wouldn't touch this in here. So film there. Now performance, this is also important for your rendering. Usually when you're rendering with your CPU, you would keep this value low, maybe between 16 pixels by 16 pixels or 64 by 64. And the reason for this is that your CPU is calculating stuff really fast, but sequentially, meaning it calculates one thing, then it goes to another, to another, to another. So you want to keep the tiles really low so it can quickly go to each tile. But your GPU, when it's rendering, it can render multiple things at the same time. So you want really big values to render everything. So that's kind of how you can optimize tiles. If you see some really long render times, you can change tile size to see if that helps, basically. Then we have bake. This is just for baking materials. Won't go much into that, but you can basically select 2 objects and then bake from one object to another materials. This can be useful for low poly to high poly or high poly to low poly baking of normal maps or albedo maps, stuff like that. And the last thing we are going to go over is color management. This is basically what color style you want. So if I click in here and go to Filmic, this will give you a bit more realistic look, but the colors are not that vibrant. So it will look more realistic for a lot of scenes, but you won't get that bright. So this might be better for animation, but then for more realistic scenes, you might want Filmic, and then you also have your contrast if you want to kind of still blow out colors a bit. Now if you go to standard, you can see how really blown out the colors are. And in here you have your exposure if you really want to change it. You can blow out a bit the light and also gamma. So these are some kind of basic options that you can change in here. Of course, later you can go into compositing and add or change color or hue or something like that in there. But here you still have some basic edits. So this is kind of basics for cycles. We can quickly also go through Eve. And in Eve you still have sampling. So if I increase this to, let's say, 64, so there is still some bouncing happening, still some rays casted. And you can also increase this, but the more we increase, the lower our frame rate will be, or it will need more time to settle. So it will take a basically longer time. So I'm gonna bring it back to 16. Now we can see that our quality in here is not that great, but the scene is really fast and responsive, and our hardware is not taking too long time to render something that we don't really need that much rendered. For ambient occlusion, you can increase the quality by changing the distance, tracing precision. So for most options, when it comes to Eve, will be just increasing kind of the quality, since there is some places where it kind of needs to remove quality so you get that responsive render. Then you have your bloom. We went through threshold. You can also do intensity and some other stuff that are not that important. We have depth of field. Screen space. In here you can also enable a refraction. When the light kind of bends when it goes through the object. That is happening in here, so you can also enable it. And you can see the precision. Of course, that's quality, but it remove performance. Motion blur. Also with Eve, you can also render finalized scenes with Eve, so you don't actually have to use cycles. And that will speed up your renders, but of course the quality will be from Eve. And for some things, like maybe you have like a render that you want to do in Blender that looks like a game or something, you might use Eve because that will more accurately represent how game engines render scenes. So it will look more like a game. So, or maybe you have like a cartoony or something like that, that scene that is cartoony. Eve might be even a better option because you don't need all that indirect lighting, bouncing, stuff like that. So that is where this motion blur comes from, and other options where you can also scale them up to work for that. You can increase the quality of normals in here. Shadows, this is one important one, where you can increase the quality of shadows. And always keep in mind, whenever you increase it, of course, increase the render frame, the tick render frames, since it's in real time. But when you increase the options for this part, it will only affect how long it takes to bake. So if I do, let's say, 6 bounces, let's do 1024, and let's delete cache and try to bake. Now we can see my baking times are way longer, but I will get higher quality bounces. Next thing would be film. Here we also have transparency, and we can see on the edges how it disappears when we enable transparency. We have the simplify, same thing. And the last thing is color management that we already left. That kind of stays the same for any render engine that we have. So yeah, that's kind of the settings that you need to keep in mind when you want to decrease or increase the quality of your renders.